Thank you for stopping by. I am Jeffrey Weiss, your political activist, keeping you informed of local and world events. Today we discuss disasters in the world. Are you aware of such disasters, or do you avoid painful stories? Well, it's your obligation to know, and it's your obligation to help. So listen and learn. The impact of drone strikes. A day of celebration quickly turned into a funeral after a U.S. drone struck a wedding procession December 12, 2013 in Yemen. The missile killed the bride and a dozen family members and friends. The United States has not revealed the reason behind the murder. Drone strikes don't just happen in Yemen. During the course of America's war on terror, over 2,000 Pakistanis have been killed, including 176 children. Even though the U.S. says they are targeting terrorists, civilians are paying the price for drone strikes. Take the story of Nabila Rahim, a 9-year-old girl who testified in Congress, along with her family, about how drone strikes killed their grandmother in North Waziristan. Her father, Rafiq, described how the drones seriously disrupt life. Our children live in fear. They don't want to go to school. They don't want to play outside. These attacks are in violation of international law for killing civilians and violating sovereignty. 2. The ongoing slaughter of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. Under San Suu Kyi, who won the Nobel Prize for Peace, she took over leadership in the country from the military junta. The world expected a change. But the country, under her rule, is persecuting the Rohingya Muslim minority. More than 9,000 have been killed in sectarian violence, and 540,000 are now confined to camps after fleeing violence. Some would go as far as calling them concentration camps. It has been described of what life is like in the cramped and squalid camps, which face a long list of problems, including the removal of aid groups, malnutrition, and waterborne illnesses. While the recent round of violence has lasted for 2 years, the country's 1.3 million Rohingya Muslims have faced a long history of discrimination and persecution at the hands of Buddhists, according to the United Nations. These Buddhist monks' movements are exacerbating a deep ethnic divide. Burning buildings, beating Muslims, attacking buses transporting Muslims are some of the attacks committed by Myanmar Buddhists. 3. Unreported horrors in the world's most isolated country, North Korea. There's not enough information on what horrors prisoners face in North Korea. People live in fear of being punished if they speak out or escape the country. The country, ruled under isolation, does not reveal much to the outside world, but with great research and efforts by the United Nations, we've learned more about North Korean human rights abuses against its own people. The UN estimates there are 120,000 North Koreans in camps. Abuses by the government include deliberate starvation, forced labor, executions, torture, rape, and denial of reproductive rights enforced through punishment, forced abortion, and infanticide. The UN calls these abuses, hurting more than 24 million people, systemic, widespread, and gross human rights violations. Information is limited, but the North Korean government has even been compared to the Nazis. 4. Horrifying human rights violations in Syria. The tragic situation in Syria saw some of its bloody days recently, with 700 killed during fighting between pro-government forces and fighters for the militant Islamic State group. It did not manage to make much of a splash in the headlines, taking a backseat to Gaza and Ukraine. Syria's conflict has raged since 2011, and its narrative is complex, polarized, and fractured. As the situation continues and the international community drags its feet, the humanitarian crisis in Syria only worsens. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the death toll is now above 90,000, with a third of those deaths being civilian. And now approximately 9 million Syrians have fled the country. Within Syria, 6.5 million are internally displaced. It's a nightmare that seems unending. The Syrian government has indiscriminately killed civilians using random shelling and in some cases chemical weapons, all condemned under international law. Pro-government forces host unfathomable torture chambers, and rebel jihadist forces brutally execute those who cross them. 5. Cultural and political rights denied in Tibet and Xinjiang. Free Tibet is a slogan that in some ways is synonymous with our nation's modern protest culture. It's a struggle that's ongoing even if it's not in the headlines. China is still depriving the people of their cultural and political rights in Tibet and Xinjiang, two autonomous regions in the country. Both Tibet and Xinjiang are subject to punishments such as torture, long-time detentions, intrusive surveillance, and squashing protest. More than 3 million live in Tibet and more than 20 million in Xinjiang. Tibet first came under Chinese occupation in 1950, and until it is freed, its spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, remains outside of the occupied country. China's authoritarian government has pushed Tibetans to relocate and put them into new housing by way of forcible mass migration. There are now 20,000 Tibetans refugees in Nepal, and the Chinese government is pressuring the country to hand them over. The Xinjiang region is home to the country's Muslim minority Uyghurs, who face immense discrimination and restrictions based on their religion. China recently responded to a wave of violence in the Muslim-populated Xinjiang region by publicly executing 55 suspected terrorists in front of a crowd of 7,000. 6. Yemen. The conflict has its roots in the failure of political transition supposed to bring stability to Yemen following an Arab Spring uprising that forced its long-term authoritarian president Sahil to hand over power to Deputy Mansour Hadi in 2011. The Hutu movement took advantage of the new president's weakness by taking control of their northern heartland of Sa'd province and neighboring areas. Disillusioned with the transition, many ordinary Yemenis, including Sunnis, supported the Hutus, and in late 2014 and early 2015, the rebels took over Sana'a. Pro-government forces made up of soldiers loyal to President Hadi and predominantly Sunni southern tribesmen and separatists were successful in stopping the rebels taking Aden, but only after a fierce 4-month battle. Coalition ground troops landed in Aden in August of 2015 and helped drive the Hutus and their allies out of much of the south. The Houthis, meanwhile, have not been dislodged from Sana'a and have been able to maintain a siege of the southern city of Tazi and to fire mortars and missiles across the border into Saudi Arabia. The coalition said it wanted to halt the smuggling of weapons to rebels by Iran, an accusation Tehran denied, but the UN said the restrictions could trigger the largest famine the world has seen for many decades. After 1,000 days of war in Yemen, 9 million people are at risk for starvation. In short, the situation in Yemen is, the UN says, the world's worst man-made humanitarian disaster. More than 11,000 have been killed and 52,000 injured since March of 2015, the UN says. At least 7,000 of those killed and 10,000 of those injured up to December 14, 2017, were civilians. Saudi-led coalition airstrikes were the leading cause of overall civilian casualties. And of course we know that it is the United States that predominantly supplies Saudi Arabia with its military weapons. About 75% of the population, 22.2 million people, are in need of humanitarian assistance, including 13 million people in acute need who urgently require immediate assistance to survive. Some 17.8 million people do not know where their next meal is coming from, and 8.4 million are considered at risk of starvation. Severe acute malnutrition is threatening the lives of almost 400,000 children under the age of 5. Diphtheria is returning to Yemen as a result of the country's civil war. With only half of the country's 3,500 health facilities fully functioning, at least 16.4 million people are lacking basic health care. Medics have struggled to cope with the world's largest cholera outbreak, which has resulted in more than 1 million suspected cases and 2,248 associated deaths since April of 2017. More than 3 million people have been forced to flee their homes in the past 3 years, including 2 million who remain displaced. 6. A worldwide threat against the world's native populations. In 90 countries around the world, as many as 370 million indigenous people are under threat. In some cases, they are being forced to flee their native land that they've held for generations. They are being deliberately discriminated by exclusion of economic, political, cultural, and human rights. Take, for example, Ethiopia, where the government is currently grabbing land from indigenous groups in South Omo. Tribal and ethnic groups like the Mursis are being forced to leave their ancestral homes to make way for huge economic projects. While the Ethiopian government claims that the groups are leaving their homes out of their own free will, groups like think tank Oakland Institute say the country is using beatings, killings, and rapes in order to clear the land. It's a phenomenon that could lead to the end of the world's indigenous populations. 7. Civil war in the world's youngest country. The world's youngest country is already facing incomprehensible human rights violations by way of civil war. South Sudan, which gained its independence from Sudan 3 years ago, faces violence between two warring oil-producing states. The violence, which is brewing over oil control and disputed border, is coming at a steep price for the South Sudan civilians. According to the UN, 50,000 South Sudanese children could die this year unless they receive assistance, and 10,000 have died in the ongoing war, the crisis group claims, and 45,000 have fled to a UN base, and hundreds of children have been killed. South Sudan government and anti-government forces have also heartlessly destroyed civilian property, as well as humanitarian aid facilities. Sudan has dangerously been on the same single path of carrying out war crimes for years, including torture, arrest, and indiscriminate shelling of South Sudan. The government has targeted civilians along with ethnic lines in South Sudan, along with reports of rape, sexual abuse, kidnapping, widespread killings, according to the UN. 8. Ethnic cleansing in the Central African Republic. Search for news from the Central African Republic and you'll hear about harrowing tales of ethnic cleansing from the country for both its Muslim and Christians. Back in March 2013, the Sika military ousted then President Francois Bozier, then spent the following 10 months targeting the country's Christian population by burning down villages and widespread looting and killings. The tables have now turned. Christian militias are aggressively retaliating to repel the Muslim population altogether as the Salika military retreats. Christians are chasing Muslims, killing them by the hundreds with machine guns and machetes. The United Nations says that the situation continues to escalate to this day. More than 1 million have left the country. Thousands have died, but the death toll is unclear because many refugees report having buried their family members. Can you help? Yes, there are definitely ways that you can help from where you are now, at this time and place. United Way Worldwide. Task Force for Global Health, Feeding America, Salvation Army, UMCA of the USA, St. Jude's Children Research Hospital, Food for the Poor, Boys and Girls Club of America, Catholic Charities of the U.S., Goodwill Industries International, Habitat for Humanity International, World Vision, American Cancer Society, Patient Access Network Foundation, Compassion International, and most important, Doctors Without Borders. Look for the information, seek it out. Don't sit back comfortably and watch their sitcoms. Find ways to help. They're out there. It's up to you. Please do what you can. If my articles interest you, please use the link to check out my website and books. Thank you very much.